There we go. All right. Got it. We will call to order this meeting of the Eastern Reading Region 9 Joint Policy Committee at 9:01 a.m. on September 23rd, 2022. And I invite Sarah to call to order for Region 9.
We will call to order Region 9 policy meeting on Friday, September 23rd. It is 9:01 a.m. and members in attendance right now are Sarah Lieberger and Kathy Thompson from Region 9.
And Chris Park and John Stinson for the Joint Policy Committee, as well as being joined by our Easton Chair, Randy Hicks, and from an administration standpoint, Dr. Pearson Ugall. So welcome, everybody. Our first item on the agenda is public comment. No members of the public being present. I think we'll move to committee member comment. Good. Hearing none, we'll jump into discussion and possible action. Before we dive in to this sort of policy review and sort of looking through the document that Dr. McKinnon distributed, that I think the plan is to post on the website. Maybe we should check in first with Dr. Pearson Ugall. Any administrative updates that we want to make sure to reserve time for?
No, I would say the most significant update is really the substantial work that Dr. McKinnon took on this week to try and organize that overview with active links. We have been realizing in the first week of school some policies that appear to not fit into any of the categories yet discussed, but still need to be active policies. So I'm sure that will be part of the work.
Okay, very good. So then I think we can go to A, which will be the policy review. And I think that one of the ways that we can approach this is by looking at the document that Dr. McKinnon sent. So I'm going to do share screen. Yeah. And I know I'm going to have to zoom in just for my own purposes. So I think that's working. Can everyone see that all right?
Yes.
Okay. So just a little bit of context for anyone viewing on YouTube or anyone who's just needs a refresher. So we worked together over the course of about 6 months to review the entirety of a model policy book from Shipman and Goodwin. We had previously spent a lot of time looking through a CABE policy manual. The Shipman and Goodwin manual was significantly shorter, more to the point, and more aligned to the specifics of state statutory obligations and federal obligations that boards of education have. And so we found it to be a sort of quicker path to get there. We also find that the subscription service to make sure that this is consistently up to date from Shipman and Goodwin is very reasonable in terms of the price. And it's also a win because Shipman and Goodwin are our attorneys. And so when we're using policy that comes from them, that is written by them, it certainly makes it easier to sort of ask them to sort of defend the positions articulated within that policy. Any additional sort of comment, sort of overview of the process that anyone would like to make? Anything important that I'm leaving out?
No, I think just that we're kind of through the major phase one. We have probably a major phase two to get through before we get into a regular cadence. But
I think that's right. So regular phase one was each of us. So we worked together to say, hey, what are the policies? We sort of put all of the sample policies in a sort of central location. We reviewed them carefully. We met regularly weekly to say, what does this mean? Does this make sense? And to sort of go through the process largely as a group. Then towards the end of the process, as we were looking at bringing them to our individual boards for approval, we sort of split off a little bit, but we ended up in roughly the same place. And you can see here, when it comes to this section 1000, automatic external defibrillators, deadly weapons, green cleaning, non-discrimination, we have the same titles of policies. And if we drill in, I think the only major differences that we're going to see are going to be if it says the Easton Board of Education or the Reading Board of Education or the Region 9, we did actually on the Easton side and the Reading side try to limit that as much as possible, because it's not necessary for the policy to say the Easton Board when it's in the Easton Board's policy manual. So we did try to make it so that the actual language in each one of these was consistent, but there may be cases where there are some differences. And so just to make it perfectly clear which policy is from which board and what it says, Dr. McKinnon has worked to build this sort of centralized index where people would be able to go in and say, show me the Easton policy on pesticide application on school property, or they could go and look at the Region 9. Good.
Yeah, I mean, I view this as sort of an above the fold and below the fold document, where above the fold is where we have adopted shipment policies in a generally wholesale fashion, and below the fold is where we have legacy policies that are the subject of further discussion to figure out which direction we're going before we consider this project substantially completed.
Yeah. And so to that point, if we look at the 1000 series and we see from row 5 down to row 16, we look at the 2000 series from row 18 to 20, and we can go through each one of these major categories, these series, and find all the sort of the policy that we adopted. And then if we scroll down, we see there's a significant number of existing policies. And so we have them.
And I might suggest not labeling that existing policies, because they're all existing policies at this point.
That's true.
Those are really legacy policies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. So maybe put a little comment. Good. And then we have different categories. So starting with community relations, then administration, business, personnel, students, instruction, and that's it. Now, it is worth noting that when we sort of look at each one of these sections, it's not a function of us saying that these policies aren't important. It's a function of there's complexity here. Basically, any policies that we had approved in the sort of recent history, say the last three years or so, we had a sort of an outlook on most of that to say, let's just leave it. We already talked about this recently. The boards have reviewed and approved. And if we need to come back because there's been a meaningful change in the laws, let's make that some of our first priority. So I think that should be something that we spend some time looking at in these sessions is, which ones of these should we bubble up to the top? There are also,
John, it may help to include in the margin or in a different column here, the date by which these policies were adopted, because that'll help when you're just looking and saying, there's 30 of them, where should I focus my time? Right. The ones from 1997 are probably more important to look at than the ones from 2019. Right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. In the document that we were using as our working document, we had tagged policies with an age, and that helped us to.
But I do think that when this is ultimately published, having a date approved by column will be helpful as a control, basically, so that everybody recognizes what happened and nobody has to go into each one of these to realize when the last time it was that it was reviewed. Because I know a lot of times people open policies and they say, I've never read this before. You were on the board 18 months ago and we adopted it. Oh, whoops.
Right. I don't know what you're talking about. That conversation has never happened, Chris. So a lot of what we'll find in here when it comes to things like contracts or sort of understanding the sort of duties of central office personnel and how we hire, any of the things where it actually requires cooperation amongst the boards, those are more sort of complex policies as well. And we'll certainly want to make sure that they're on our list. We have certain almost memorandums of understanding that we've talked about within the last couple of years to say, hey, this is generally how we work. And I think we've tended to avoid controversy in the last few years because we've talked about how those things will work. But we definitely want to take a look at any of the pieces that require us to sort of work together that are enshrined in policy. Okay, good.
Can I? Maybe this is a question for Stephanie, but in practice, when this is loaded onto the website that's publicly available, will will the link look like this, or will the column for Easton be on the Easton Schools website? Will the column for Reading be on the Reading Schools website? And will the Region 9 column be for the Barlow site? Or will it look like this? So as a parent, for example, when you go in, will you see the 3 columns?
I think that's a good question, Kathy. Right now, the way it's been set up is that this one overview document provides links to all 3. So I think the hope is that this in some ways would replace the kind of the 3 different drop-down menus for policies specifically. We're looking at doing a more major overhaul of the entire website. So I think in the website redesign, we can look at more of a Google-based structure, so that rather than having to go to those drop-down menus and then drill down with each one of the drop-downs, it might help with communication if it's laid out in a way so that if a member of the community, a parent, is interested in learning about policies, they click on policies, and then from that link, they can see these 3 different columns. But I don't think any final decisions have been made. So certainly if you all have input into that, that's welcome.
I favor this approach with the additional explanatory note under Easton that says Samuel Staples Elementary School and Helen Keller Middle School and across the way, because everyone on this call understands what those 3 things mean, but at least half the community thinks Region 9 and Staples are the same thing and things like that. So
Yeah.
The largest misunderstanding I would say is that there are many people who believe, including some staff members, that Region 9 includes all 3 districts.
Right.
Yeah.
I've been sent Region 9 policies and told, why doesn't this apply to my kid at XYZ school in Reading, and had to explain that it's a different school district.
Right. Right. Or they call it the ER9 school district.
Right.
I like this view as well because, and apologies everyone for being late. I like this view as well because I'm thinking about the reader who may have a child in multiple buildings or children in multiple buildings, and to have the context of, okay, what does this mean for my kid in Sam Staples versus the kid at Barlow versus the kid at RES? It's very helpful. And just trying to just remember, oh, well, we have a weighted grading policy, and where is that tab in that folder? And it's very confusing. And I think it's very helpful. And I do like the being able to clearly define the time period. So I think when you click through the hot links, you'll see the actual policy, right? So I think it's very helpful. And then it also clearly delineates what applies to which building.
And what'll be helpful
once we put that
note,
yeah.
with all these being in a Google Doc format, is that in a future Google-based website, it'll all be text searchable in a way that the current policies are very hit or miss as to what's an image and what's text. So you ought to be able to search all of these for the word green, and all 3 green cleaning program policies will come up through a site search. And I think that'll be substantially helpful to the public.
Yeah, it will also be translatable. And currently our policies, some are and some aren't.
That's great.
And not to extend the conversation, but just looking at the Shipman Goodwin, looking at the legacy, is it logical to assume that we'll always have some sort of legacy or specific region policies, and we'll always have sort of the bigger picture Shipman policies? Is that?
I think it's fair to say that there is likely to be forever certain policies that are unique to districts. I think when we went through with Shipman and Goodwin most recently, and we had gone through a process of flagging various policies where we had questions, where we said, hold on a second, like, does this make sense? Or, this policy specifically obviously only applies to kids who are aged to be at a high school. This wouldn't make sense for kids at a middle school or an elementary school. And so it's like, does it matter if we have that on our books in Easton? And, or, can we change this language? They helped us to understand that some of the policies are, hey, there's a bright line here. You absolutely have to have this. It's important because it protects you in this way, and this way, and this way. It makes it clear to the right. Okay. And then there are other policies that are, hey, this is nice to have because of these situations that can occur. It's good if you have a policy. And, but if you want to change it in significant ways, you can, and here are the ways that we would recommend that you change that. So I think for that reason, we may find differences. I think there are different philosophies amongst the boards as to whether or not, we say, hey, look, do we get a lot of bang for our buck in customizing this, in sort of putting Easton's name at the top instead of just saying the district? I think that those differences may cause some of the, sort of differing policies district by district. But I would put that aside and say there are actually meaningful reasons for them, for there to be differences.
Yeah.
But are we going to have 30 legacy policies? I really hope not. I hope it's going to be more like a year from now, we have all of the shipment policies, and where we need to have differences because of district differences, then we have those differences, but not because we've put off attacking the here's how we hire people question.
Yeah, I think it's tremendously important that we find common ground across 3 districts on several key areas, including purchasing and financing policies that give rise to all kinds of complications if they go in different directions. The way in which we manage central office hiring and compensation and management and things like that. Anywhere where there's complexity and a single operational goal is possible, we should be pursuing it. The only way I would think that we should be divergent is for specific peculiarities that relate to the fact that we have different levels of education in the different districts.
Right.
Yeah.
Or where the regional district has slightly different statutes that apply to them
right.
and the local districts do.
Or facilities as well, right? So if it says, your soccer fields and we have soccer fields and you don't, then okay, well, we could see a difference there. There's also a question of, is there harm in having a policy about facilities if they don't exist now, but could exist in the future? It might be actually beneficial to have the policy already in place. So.
And I think an example of that, as you'll notice, if you look across up top under 1000 community board and operations, there's a pool safety plan.
Mm-hmm.
So Region 9 didn't approve the pool safety plan, whereas Easton and Reading did. So there's one area as an example of something that's not fully across the board. It could be, and maybe that would change in the future at one point in time. But as of right now, that's just how it moved forward.
Yeah. And so I think there's some work for us to do. So I think we're starting to get a better sense of what is the work ahead of us.
Just as a comment on the pool safety plan in particular, and I'm sorry to derail this further, but I think that's a good example of where overthinking creates a problem. And the pool safety plan doesn't apply to pools that exist in your building. It applies to aquatic activities that your students participate in.
Right.
Barlow has a swim team and it sends people to aquatic facilities. It should have a pool safety plan.
Right.
Reading and Easton have none of those things, but adopted the plan because there's a chance that at some point, maybe in the middle schools, we'll be sending kids to swim somewhere, and it's good to have the policy in place.
Right.
So this is where somebody said, we don't have a pool, we don't need to adopt this. And I'm not sure that's particularly helpful, which is,
Well, and or other complexity that may have said, hey, let's not derail the entire process because there are questions amongst board members on Region 9 saying, hey, what about this part and this part and this part? And we said, and maybe they said, let's punt on it for now and come back to it. Which,
yeah. If I just so I can sorry to interrupt. So just so I can close a loop on that and try to get past his historical decision making and rationale. I think, Randy, to kind of bring you up to speed from a substantive perspective, right? Truly applicable to the student in the building. Probably sunscreen is a better example, right? Application of sunscreen, and that's mandated by the state, where there really is. I don't think we would ever have that at Barlow, so that's a truly legitimate one. On the flip side, too, weighted grading. We will never have weighted grading in K through 8, right? So those are true. I think disagreements on process aside. Those are true two examples of really substantive changes where it really matters what's applicable in the building. But I mean, again, point taken, Chris, on your, even though it's not applicable, why not adopt it? That's fair, but that's kind of, I think, characterized as more of a process disagreement across the boards, as opposed to substantively what should apply to all of our children, regardless of what schools they attend, right? And to our staff,
Mhm.
regardless of what schools they work.
Can I
Correct.
can I clarify further around the pool safety plan, which, and as well the ones that say in parens regulation only? The pool safety plan is actually a regulation.
Yep.
It's not noted here, but when you look at the policy, it is a regulation.
Yep.
And Shipman and Goodwin had advised us as a board to not adopt regulations, that it potentially set a precedent that we should not set, which is why the pool safety plan and some of the others are not adopted in the Region 9 column. We did not adopt as a board regulations in this context, which is, it wasn't that we had an issue with the pool safety plan. It was that Shipman and Goodwin had recommended that we not adopt regulation in the context of adopting policy. So that's one of the fine points that when we go through this document, I think a note might be that that's a regulation, not a policy, which leads me to a second point about, in the context of policy, do we want to specify regulation only? Is that potentially confusing to someone who's reading policy? And what's the difference between a regulation and a policy? And how do we want to handle that for the person who's using this as a parent, for example? Is that confusing to somebody? And how do we want to discuss, present that in the context of policy?
Yeah, I think it's a really relevant topic, and I think we would benefit from having Shipman and Goodwin join us, because I know that when we did all together and we did the sort of walkthrough of all the sort of our read on these, and we talked about the sort of policy versus regulation, and at the time with the attorney we were talking to, I don't think there was as bright a line about do not adopt regulation. And so I suspect that maybe that conversation happened in subsequent conversations where Region 9 engaged with attorneys, where they said do not. I think it was more of a you can, and here's the upside, here's the downside. So I think we can come back to that and wrestle with the sort of question of regulation versus policy. I would put that on our list. I would put sort of looking through all of the legacy policies. I would put that on our list. And I would say that a walkthrough of sort of all of the stuff that we said, hey, here's what we approved. I think we should all just make sure that this document is 100% accurate and is reflecting sort of what we all approved at our various boards. And so thinking about that work and thinking about the way that we intend to coordinate our energy in the future, I think a part of what we're looking to do is to not continue, with the sort of weekly cadence, but sort of turn this into perhaps a monthly cadence. And that would mean that we walk away with more homework, that we each walk away with more work to do. And I would say the three things that I just listed. So verifying that everything in our respective columns is accurate, making sure that we take a look at and prioritize our respective legacy policies and come to our next meeting with an agenda, with an idea of here are the policies that I think are really important for us to handle first. I think it would be useful in our time remaining today to talk a little bit about what is our rubric for that? How should we score whether or not something is urgent, is important for us to look at from a legacy perspective. And then I think the sort of other question about sort of regulation versus policy and those questions, that could be another thing that we could think about as homework. Anyone have sort of other thoughts about the process? Does anyone disagree? Does anyone say, hey, we really should keep meeting weekly, or we should just, meet quarterly starting now? Any thoughts about that?
My only thought is that because the boards had approved these updated policies back in June, or I think everybody was in June sometime. And this is a great document that Dr. McKinnon has put together. But we need to get them, I think, updated quickly for the public. So I wouldn't want to hold up the posting of the newly updated policies while we still sort out the legacy policies. And is there a way, and we don't have to resolve it now, but I would just ask, is there a way to get the new ones updated in a timely way?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. I totally agree with that. And I would propose that, maybe we meet next Friday for the purpose of, like, the only homework we're focused on is not, like, let's look through and prioritize our legacy stuff. It is review this document, think about any feedback you have, like adding the school names, adding dates, anything that might be incorrect, anything that's not in the right spot. And if we came back next Friday with that, with the intent of saying, yes, we've all reviewed it, we agree this is what we talked about, we agree this is what was approved at our boards, and yes, please, let's post it. That would allow us to get something posted, either next Friday or early the following week. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that this is probably substantially complete, but it needs to be public facing, because the policies on the website are no longer the policies.
Right. Yeah.
And haven't been for several months. Right. But the question you asked about what the cadence should be going forward, I think requires an answer to the question of what is our horizon for finishing the second tranche of work, which is sort of reviewing the legacy policies, where we kind of put them in the parking lot because they were too controversial to tackle in the first round.
Right.
Is this a June of this year trajectory, or is this a December of this year trajectory?
Right. So if we meet next Friday with the purpose of saying, yes, we're happy with this, our next meeting, I think we were targeting the third Friday of each month. Our next meeting would be October 21st. I'm right about that, right, Sarah?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. So we would shoot for the 21st of October. So we meet the 30th for the purposes of saying, hey, this is good. Yeah, yes, please, let's post. Then we meet the 21st of October. Sorry. Yes.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, good. And on that date, we would be looking to agree on which legacy policy, so the prioritization process. So we should have actually reviewed those policies in order to understand why we're bringing them, and saying that this one should be prioritized. And so we should be able to have a fairly meaningful conversation on the 21st about sort of which ones we're going to talk about first. And if we can move quickly through that prioritization process or sort of discussion, we could get into the meat of that work as well.
I think that there are sort of natural groupings of some of these legacy policies around human resources, around finance, around Title IX, sex harassment, things like that, FMLA. We can probably identify 3 or 4 buckets to then concentrate the work around that, and on a monthly basis tackle each one of those topics and all the policies that go around that. But what I would do is I would ask the administration which policies are most important for them to get resolved, and the answer might relate to the budget making process and what they need resolved or would like to have resolved before we get into that process in December, January, February.
Okay. So if we're looking at a December, January, February resolution, then it would mean we need to meet, discuss, and recommend to our boards. Boards need to do first reading, boards need to do second reading.
It doesn't work on the current cadence.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would be worried about trying to jam through the more contentious ones in at the same time we're all going through budgets.
Yeah.
The answer might be that it's impossible.
Yeah. What also might be what also might be the answer is if administration says no, none of these are actually relevant to the budget, and that don't worry about it. Like, none of these have to be approved in time for the budget. So maybe the homework. I think maybe the homework, if Dr. Pearson-Ugal is open to bringing this back to administration, is review the legacy policies with an eye towards, are any of these things that are urgent either for the purposes of budget or frankly any other purpose, are any of these ones that you say, hey, this is white hot, we really need to get this right now?
Yes, so I've highlighted that, and I will certainly bring that back for discussion with Dr. McKinnon when he's back in district.
Okay.
I think John and Sarah, I think as chairs of the respective committees, I think it's reasonable to, if we meet next week, only to talk to the accuracy of this. So it sounds like there's consensus around this format and the accuracy of this, and then the timetable by which this version will be published, notwithstanding the minor changes we talked about and what's still in the parking lot. Come up with and agree on a plan of communication as recommended by the administration next week, run that to the ground, and then concur, and then start either, if we have time next week or perhaps the next meeting, to really come to consensus on how we deal with the parking lot items. And then I'm looking at the board calendar on the ER9 website, and if possible, this might be a big lift, and Stephanie, I'll defer to you and Jason and the administration if it is communicate from both committees to the tri-boards. This is the plan for the parking lot items, including the timetable. Speak now or forever hold your peace. And we would love not to deviate and have different processes. Totally get we're separate governance. So that message has to be very clear. Yeah. With the intention of trying to make this most efficient for everyone, not trying to create new processes. Like there's got to be a better way to, and it's probably good we have newer people on here that can kind of diffuse that a little bit. So that would be my suggestion, and certainly not to rush something, especially if the administration says, no, these are the must-haves versus the nice-to-haves, and Shipman says, okay, yeah, that's cool. We could wait for this group by June, by the end of June. To me, I think June, the end of the school year, is a reasonable target to brush up everything, to finish everything.
I agree with that.
Right.
Sarah had sent out a note to everybody a few weeks ago, which was an update from Shipman as to recent legislation that occurred over the summer or spring, which we tabled at the time as those updates were coming through. We tabled them because we had to focus on updating where we already were. So some of those were into effect in July.
Yeah.
So I would suggest that there's not that many of them. Some of them are new, don't relate to a legacy policy that we have in place. Right. So might I suggest that we review the Shipman and Goodwin updates and address those so that we are current with legislation?
Yeah, I think our target, if we were going to say June as our target, that's not just to review the legacy. It's to also include in that process sort of everything that's in the parking lot, which should be any new new statutes or policy that is coming down from Shipman.
Were you suggesting also, John, that we try and get them on one of the next meetings to talk about the regs as well? Do you think it's more beneficial to have them in September versus October?
Maybe we don't need to do that. If they have said to Region 9 very clearly, don't approve the regulations, and no one on this committee believes that it's really important that we have the regulations, I don't believe that. I think, if that's what they've given us as advice, I'm fine following that. I think there's another question about whether or not we actually want to remove some of the regulations that have been approved in Easton and Reading. I think that's a separate question, but one that perhaps can wait.
I think that there's sort of nested questions there. One is whether or not boards should be in the business of adopting regulations. And I think the general view that this committee has taken over time is that the answer is no, and that those are in the province of the administration. The second question is where regulation should show up vis-a-vis policies, because right now, the way the website exists, you've got a policy and a regulation all in one long PDF, and it kind of blends together. And I think in the past, they've more or less been adopted in a batch manner. I would foresee a world where the administration is actually drafting and approving regulations that exist, to complement these policies. It might be a circumstance where they are on this same sheet with a different header, or are noted somewhat differently. But from the public's perspective, it really doesn't matter whether it's a policy or regulation. It's something that applies to the operation of the schools and to their students. And whether the policy says you can't bring a knife to school, or the regulation says you can't bring a knife to school, the outcome is the same for the student. It only matters from a governance perspective what they're called.
Okay.
So let me just add a couple of points. I do think that most members of the public don't really understand the difference between policies and regulations. So I'm certainly support sort of clarifying and making this as succinct as possible. The second thing is that last week I attended a Shipman and Goodwin legislative update. And so on the list, you asked me to bring back sort of the priorities, both for the budget process and also other. There might be in that other category a lot of things that are coming out in terms of the legislative update that need to be in place either this year or next year.
And do you mean the calendar, like the calendar year or the school year?
I mean the school year. So in most cases they say July 1st. But there are a number of updates that actually should be in place this year. And of course, we will always default to following the law. But we want to try and make sure that our policies reflect the current law.
And I want to sort of point a laser pointer at that last statement because it has been true. And I think it's important that the public understands that when there is a new law passed, the administration follows the law. And the degree to which our board policy manuals have been consistent in articulating here is the law that we will follow and how we're going to follow that law, that's a big part of what we're trying to fix. So this is not a function of we've had to go through this effort because what's happening in the schools is not consistent with law. It is a function of we need to know what the laws are as board members. We need to pass policies that reflect those laws as well. So thanks. Thank you, Stephanie, for bringing that up. All right. So do we have a good list of our takeaways and what we're looking to accomplish? I think the question about cadence, we may be able to, I think we would revisit it also on October 21st. So if we walk away, if we meet next week, we're able to approve this document and say we're comfortable with this document being posted. Here's our feedback on the document. We also should, sort of make sure that we're getting any feedback from the administration if there's anything that should be prioritized above and beyond. But then we're walking away from that meeting with 3 weeks to go review everything in the parking lot and to make sure that we have a firm grasp on those things in the parking lot so that we can say, here are the things that I believe we should prioritize. If in the conversation on the 21st, we can say, oh, I think this one, we can get through that in 10 minutes, then we jump right into the work of actually reviewing and trying to come up with policy that we can approve and send to our respective boards. If on the 21st, as we do that process, we say, oh man, there's a lot that's really important. We're all agreeing that there's a lot that's really important. Maybe it's not going to be once a month, maybe it's going to be every other week. And so we figure it out at that point, based on sort of how we all understand the landscape. Cool. Good. Okay. So game plan is review this, make sure we're really happy with this for next week. Good.
Good.
Cool. Any other items that we want to touch on before we wrap? Okay.
Quick question, John. and there's a lot there. The Shipman Goodwin, the legacy, loading that to the website. Will everything get loaded, including quote unquote the legacy that we all acknowledge we're still working through? Okay.
Yes.
I think that's right. But I would sure.
The legacy, so I think there's sort of three buckets. There's the stuff we just approved that was shipment model policy. There's the legacy policies that we did not, delete. There's another word that's more, and then there's the new stuff that we're getting from shipment as updates. I don't know about posting the new stuff. I think it's an interesting question of, here are other potential policies that we will be looking at in the next, over the course of the next 6 months. And that could be an interesting, sort of way to treat some of those items, but I don't know if people have other thoughts on that. Anyone have thoughts?
Those aren't, just to clarify, those are replacing existing policies or new policies?
It could be both, right? So a legislative update. So, stuff just changed, or there were court cases. And so shipment is saying, hey, we want to treat this and this differently. And it could be 5 items, it could be 15 items, it could be 50 items.
No.
The degree to which we definitely don't want to post that as, here are our policies, because they're not, right? We haven't even reviewed them yet. But is there utility in saying, here are other things? I don't know. It could get dicey.
I
Yeah.
just
I
feel
think
like
we're
it
already
would be too
living in
much.
this sort of like hybridized world where there's not a lot of faith that whatever you're looking at is the actual policy right now.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
don't want to add additional drafts into that mix if we can possibly avoid it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds right.
I agree with that. I think it might
People-
be.
People are
Yeah.
so overloaded with information too, that I feel like we just need to keep things clear and concise and not add to the confusion.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, good. All right. Anything else? If not, we'll go to committee member comment. And look for a motion to adjourn. Thank you, Chris. Joint Policy Committee adjourned at 9:43 a.m.
And Region 9, I'm going to go ahead and adjourn us as well at 9:43 a.m.
Great.
Thank you
everybody.
all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.